Hello everyone, this is the 7th talk of the series Inferentialism on Naturalized Grounds. Our today's speaker is Professor Diacon Marconi. He has long interest in philosophy of language. He published several books and several articles on the issues related more or less on inferences and on normativity of language. And his today's talk will be on the second topic called Grounds of Semantic Normativity. Professor Marconi, feel free to start.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation, and most of all for setting up this collection, which is really interesting, and I'm glad and honored of participating to it. So, okay, I'll probably have to rely on the slides as they are. We'll see. Anyway, this is about the grounds of semantic normativity, meaning the reasons we have to suppose that there is such a thing as semantic normativity, contrary to what some philosophers have insisted, and what are its grounds, that is, why there is semantic normativity. What do I mean in the first place for semantic normativity? Think of this example, using the word approximate to say of a town that it is nearby, or using the word caudate to refer to string musical instruments is wrong. That is not what such words mean, hence it is not how they ought to be used. These are platitudes, as I see them, and it's probably the origin of the very idea of semantic normativity. The idea is that statements of the form W means such and such are normative statements, or perhaps entail such statements. For example, when we say that, this is an example I'm going to use repeatedly, when we say that profligate means completely given up to dissipation in licentiousness, as according to Webster's Collegiate 10th edition, we assert or imply that the speaker may use profligate only to describe people that are completely given up to dissipation and licentiousness. Or perhaps that the speaker believes to be such. We'll see that there is an issue here. This view has been endorsed by many philosophers. In recent years, the normativity claim has been often identified with Saul Kripke's version of it, although Kripke's version concerns speaker's meaning, as in John means such and such by plus, rather than linguistic meaning, whereas I'm going to deal with linguistic meaning. More recently, the normativity claim has been challenged by philosophers based in Stockholm, most of them, Anandi Hathiangadi, Katrin Gluer, Åsa Wigforss, and a non-Swede, Paul Boghossian, that used to be a supporter of semantic normativity, but now no longer. I disagree with them, and I'm rather on the side of critics of them, such as Peregrine and Whiting. However, today I will only occasionally discuss the anti-normativist views. Instead, I will focus on what I take to be a more powerful objection against the inherent normativity of meaning, an objection that stems from the identification of meaning with use. And to reject the objection, I'll do basically three things. I will present an abstract model of the connection of social practices and social norms, partly inspired by Lewis' famous paper, Language and Languages. I will show that the model can be seen as applying to natural languages. Finally, or almost finally, I will give two reasons why natural languages tend to conform to the model. Let's say they approximate the model. And in conclusion, I will propose a new relational structure for meaning, normativity, and regular use. That is, I will tell you how I see the relation between these three notions, particularly between meaning and regular use. The thesis that meaning is a normative notion has been traditionally attributed to the later Wittgenstein, but in spite of that, as so often, it is not easy to find a fully explicit statement of the thesis in Wittgenstein's later writing, though Wittgenstein did say that meaning, for example, of a word is constituted by grammatical rules, as G. Moore reported, and that a word has no meaning previous to or independent of such rules. Now, that meanings are constituted by rules can be interpreted in two different ways. The claim may be that meanings can be identified with compact descriptions of regularities of use of certain sounds or scripts, or it may be that meanings are to be identified with norms governing the use of such sounds and scripts. And Wittgenstein appears to have inclined to the second interpretation or formulation. He wrote, for example, rules are in a sense statements. They say you may do such and such, whereas that you may not do. He also wrote, if a rule of the game prescribes that the kings are to be used for drawing lots before a game of chess, then that is an essential part of the game. Perhaps the alternative view, the regularity view, may be attributed to Wilfrid Sellars, though I regard the evidence as partly inconclusive. Anyway, on the regularity interpretation, meanings are regularities of use that can be described by a rule. Linguistic performances that deviate from the relevant rule or rules are incorrect. By contrast, on the prescriptive interpretation, meanings are also regularities of use which can be described by a rule, except that such rules count as prescriptions a speaker ought to obey. And linguistic performances that deviate from the relevant rule are wrong. In the paper, I discuss to some extent the Sellars' views, but here I will not go into that. Anyway, if so, it appears that only the prescriptive interpretation can account for the platitudes. For when we say that a certain use of caudate is wrong, we do not just mean that it deviates from a certain regularity, as we are going to see a bit later. A comparison to better see the point. There are many propensities we acquire by way of some training or otherwise. For example, in many countries, people acquire the propensity to watch TV in the evening. I myself, like many other people in Italy, have acquired a strong propensity to have a cup of coffee after lunch. Such habits are widespread, persistent, and even somewhat addictive. Many would miss TV if they were forced not to watch it, as I would certainly miss my coffee. However, there is nothing wrong with not watching TV occasionally or even ever, nor would it be wrong for me not to have coffee after lunch. We wouldn't say that such behavior is not what it ought to be. Opting out of a regularity of behavior is not necessarily wrong or something one ought not to do. By contrast, calling a fiddle a caudate instrument is not simply unusual. It is just wrong. Here, of course, I am asking you to share my intuitions, We'll have time to discuss them, of course, later. I take them to be quite widespread intuitions anyway. Now, suppose there are semantic norms. What would they look like? A popular candidate used to be this conditional. If a word W means dog, then for every X, W ought to be applied to X only if X is a dog. Or in other words, W ought to be applied only to dogs. This is, for example, Paul Horwich's formulation in his book on meaning. Or its stronger version, the biconditional version. If W means dog, then for every X, W ought to be applied to X if and only if X is a dog. In other words, W ought to be applied to dogs and only to dogs. Now, the phrase means dog, what does it mean? I take it to be equivalent to means whatever the word dog means in English. So supposing W to be the French word chien, then W means dog, amounts to, is equivalent to chien, is synonymous with dog. I'm not appealing to the concept dog or the abstract idea of dog or anything like that. It is just shorthand for what you read at the bottom of the slide. Now, these formulations have been more or less justifiably criticized by the Swedish philosophers, for example, concerning the first formulation, the conditional formulation, which is repeated here for convenience. Here, it has been rightly objected that if X is not a dog, it just follows that it is not the case that the speaker ought to apply dog to X, which is compatible to its being permissible to apply dog to X. But we don't want that. We don't want it to be permissible to call X a dog if it is not a dog. Similar objections can be raised against the biconditional formulation, so nothing hinges on which formulation you choose, but all such difficulties disappear if we just adopt Wittgenstein's formulation. You may do such and such, whereas that you may not do. That is, it is permissible to call a dog dog, whereas it is not permitted to call dog something that is not a dog. And this is captured by what you have at the bottom. Given that horse means horse, then for every X, horse may be applied to X if and only if X is a horse. And this is the formulation I'm going to adopt, though there is an immediate difficulty that has been given rise to a good amount of literature on semantic normativity. Both the ought, the original ought formulation or version, and the may formulation of the semantic norm entail that applications of a word W count as permitted or prescribed depending on what the object to which W is applied is, as distinct from what it is believed by the speaker to be. Therefore, if a speaker S applies horse to an object that S wrongly believes to be a horse, for in fact it's a donkey, then S's use of W counts as a violation of the semantic norm. But in such cases, as many have pointed out, while it is clear that S made a mistake, it is less obvious that her mistake is semantic in nature. Nothing obliges to think that S is somewhat incompetent in terms of knowledge of what horse means. He's just mistaking a donkey for a horse. That's a different story. It has nothing to do with his or her knowledge of language, nothing of the kind. And there are more intricate examples. For example, if a speaker S is both linguistically incompetent and factually wrong, he may turn out to be complying with the semantic norm for W while being totally confused about the meaning of W. One S believes that W means such and such, but he also believes that he is dealing with something which is such and such, whereas it is not. So ultimately, it turns out that he's complying with the semantic norm, but he's wrong both ways, and he is clearly incompetent about the meaning of W. So some philosophers, for example, Schroeder and Peregrine, have proposed that we reformulate the semantic norm in terms of beliefs. For example, for the last formulation I proposed, given that horse means horse, then for every X and every speaker S, S may apply horse to X if and only if S believes that X is a horse. Now, the first, as far as I know, the first to point out that semantic normativity is not about what is the case, but about what the speaker believes to be the case, so about truthfulness, not about truth, was David Lewis. David Lewis thought that the use of a language is based on a convention of truthfulness and trust. Trust consists in regarding other speakers as truthful, while, I quote, to be truthful in L is to try never to utter any sentences of L that are not true in L. Thus, it is to avoid any sentence of L unless one believes it to be true in L. So Lewis would probably be in favor of the formulation you find on this slide on top. There are, on the other hand, counter-arguments to adopting the belief formulations. They are briefly discussed in the paper. I will not talk about them now. So I will express indecision by adopting an ambiguous formulation, and I'll try to be consistent with the ambiguity by and by. And the formulation is this: given that horse means horse for every X and every speaker S, S may apply horse to X if and only if S believes that, between brackets, X is a horse. There is another issue that has been central in the anti-normativist criticism of the claim that meaning is normative. They hold that whatever normativity may concern the use of language doesn't come from meaning itself, which on their view is not normative at all, but from some other norm, the outstanding candidate being the norm of truth, namely one ought to speak the truth. And they say this norm, taken together with following principle, for any speaker S and any time T, if green means green for S at T, then it is correct for S to apply green to an object X if and only if X is green at T, implies that S ought to apply green only to green objects. However, the normative force does not derive from the categorization itself, i.e. the categorization of uses of green into correct and incorrect, but from the categorization in conjunction with the relevant norm. It is already clear that these critics do not take correct to be a normative concept. They take it to be a factual concept. My reaction to this is that any reasonable formulation of the semantic norm, such as the last I gave, already involves the norm of truth. For it follows from that formulation that S may assert Ribot is a horse if and only if Ribot is a horse is true, or S believes it is true, which is to say that one is permitted to assert true sentences and only true sentences, or sentences one believes to be true, which entails that one ought to speak the truth, or what one believes to be the truth. So, why unpacking the semantic norm into an allegedly non-normative component, i.e. principle CM, plus the norm of truth? And the answer, it seems to me, is that anti-normativists tend to be, as they say themselves, pure use theorists. They unqualifiedly identify meaning with use and see meanings as purely factual regularities. So in a way, there is some sort of petitio here. They are sort of proving that meaning is not normative by assuming that it is not. Now, later I will object to the unqualified identification with meaning and use, and I will eventually reject the identification of meaning with use. Not now. Moreover, anti-normativists muddle the issue by calling applications that yield true assertions, and only such applications, correct, taking correct to be factual and not normative. My tentative conclusion here is that anti-normativists may be misunderstanding the relation between semantic normativity and imperative of truthfulness. The meaning of green being what it is, truthfulness consists in applying the word green only to objects one believes to be green, that is, in complying with the semantic norm associated with green. Complying with the semantic norm associated with green, in turn, consists in calling green only the objects one believes to be green, i.e., in being truthful as concerns the use of green. So compliance with the semantic norm and truthfulness are two faces of the same coin. There is no good reason to ascribe the normativity that is expressed by the platitudes to the imperative of truthfulness rather than to meaning, as the anti-normativists contend. Paul Horwich also put forth a pure theory of meaning as used. The meaning of a linguistic expression, he says, is constituted by its use properties, which in conjunction with other factors, including properties of other expressions, explain total linguistic behavior with respect to that expression. There are laws of use, i.e. generalizations from which a word's overall deployment can be derived. A word W's law of use can be identified with its acceptant properties, which describes the circumstances in which a typical speaker is disposed to use W. For example, the explanatorily fundamental acceptance property underlying our use of red is roughly the disposition to apply red to an observed surface when and only when it is clearly red. Obviously, as I hinted a moment ago, a word's overall use cannot be derived from the law for W alone. W occurs in sentences that include other words. Hence, uses of W will be derivable from the law for W together with the laws for all co-occurring words. So far, there is nothing normative about the notion of disposition to use, so understood. Laws of use have no normative input in themselves, and therefore, against Kripke, Horwich denies that meaning is intrinsically, inherently normative. On the other hand, he admits that meaning has normative implications. Though X means dog is not equivalent to X ought to be applied only to dogs, it implies it. And this way, Horwich's theory can account for the platitudes while remaining a pure use theory. Now, Horwich argues that it is not so infrequent that the non-normative notion has normative implications in spite of Hume's principle. I am not convinced by his examples, and in the paper there is a short discussion of such examples. It seems to me that anyway, the connection between dispositions and norms is not obvious, whereas the connection between meaning and normativity appears to be both strong and immediate. Indeed, as Horwich himself pointed out, philosophers such as Kripke, Brandon, Gibbard, and Putnam rejected Wittgenstein's identification of meaning with use precisely because it rules out the normativity of meaning. Now, as I anticipated, I'm going to argue for a different view, a view on which meaning is not quite use, though it is in most cases grounded in use, and statements of meaning such as profligate means completely given up to dissipation and licentiousness should be read as both factual and normative. And this will vindicate at least some of Horwich's intuitions. So what I'll do now is I will present a general model of the relations between behavioral regularities and norms. I will claim that such a model applies to human languages, and I will show that there are reasons for such a model to apply to language. That is, that there are motivations for a language using community to look at use regularities as involving norms. Now, it must be clear from the beginning that the model I present has no explanatory power in itself. It is not by looking at the model that you can conclude that meaning is normative. The explanatory load is entirely on two other things. First of all, the historical plausibility of seeing the model as applying to natural languages, that is, given the way languages have been working, it is natural to apply to language the model I propose. And secondly, there are, let's say, sociological reasons for a community to regard regularities of use as norms, that is, to look at language according to the model, or for looking at the model as applying to their own language. And this is what I'll now try to show. Now, by the word custom, I will mean a practice that is both widespread and habitual within a human population. That is, it is habitually, not occasionally, enacted by a majority of members of the population. In many Western countries, the following are examples of customs: having breakfast in the morning, answering thank you by you are welcome, or other expressions to the same effect, using a cell phone, listening to music from some device, sleeping in a bed at night. None of these practices are universal. Some people never have breakfast in the morning, or only rarely. A few do not use a cell phone, but only a line phone, and so forth. However, almost everyone does such things in ordinary circumstances. Such practices are indeed customary. Now, imagine a normative system that is a system of prescriptions that is based on the following principles. First of all, every custom originates a prescription, i.e., if it is customary to do A in circumstances C, then it is obligatory to do A in C. Secondly, All practices that are not customary are forbidden. Hence, if a custom has receded, that is, if a practice is no longer almost universal but has become sporadic or has come to involve very few people, etc., then it is forbidden. And third, nothing else is a prescription. Call such a system a hyperconformist system. For example, in an hyperconformist system, if the custom has prevailed of having breakfast in the morning, then it is obligatory to have breakfast in the morning. Similarly, it is obligatory to answer thank you by you're welcome or the like, to use a cell phone, and so on. On the other hand, as VHS readers have gone out of fashion, it is forbidden to use them. Similarly, it is forbidden to make a bow, to kiss a lady's hand, or to write letters with pen and paper. It may seem that in a hyperconformist system there is no distinction between customs and prescriptions, for every custom originates a prescription, and there are no prescriptions to which no custom corresponds. As soon as a practice ceases to be customary, it loses normative input. So at every moment t, each norm that is in force at t has the same content as some custom prevailing at t. And every custom that prevails at t originates a norm that is binding at t. But a conceptual distinction remains. Customs as such are just widespread habits, while norms determine obligations. That most people have breakfast in the morning is just a fact or a collection of facts. That they are under the obligation of having breakfast is a different story. Clearly, neither our social system as a whole nor most of its subsystems are hyperconformist. Surely our societies are characterized by a remarkable amount of conformism. Many customs tend to acquire normative input, and once they are no longer widespread, practicing them often meets with some form of disapproval. People say that's quaint, it's obsolete, it's out of date, and so on and so forth. However, many widespread customs carry no significant normative input, such as driving a car, living in a city, being on a diet, etc. These are customary in the sense that was made clear a moment ago, but they don't seem to involve any sort of normative load. On the other hand, disappearance of a custom doesn't necessarily involve disapproval of the relevant practice. There is nothing wrong with using an old VHS reader or a line telephone, or with buying books from a physical store rather than from Amazon. The only social system that comes close to being a hyperconformist system is language. For example, there was a moment some people in England started using the word hob as a synonym of elf. That was a forbidden practice, for hob was customarily applied to people from the country. However, as the practice turned into a custom, it became utterly improper, wrong, to apply the word to country people. Or a gazetteer used to be a journalist. Nowadays, it is a geographical dictionary, and it would be wrong to apply it to journalists. We describe in part such developments by saying that hob no longer means country person, and gazetteer no longer means journalist, and so on and so forth. The history of languages offers really many examples along these lines. Of course, language only approximates a hyperconformist system. Obsolescence often determines marginality rather than real prohibition. That is, a use that went out of fashion is regarded as, well, exceptional, not uncommon. Even dictionaries regard it that way, obsolete, and so on and so forth. That is, it is no no longer the standard use, but still, it's around. On the other hand, standardization, that is the transformation of initially deviant uses into first accepted uses, then obligatory uses, is resisted by purism, that is by linguistic conservatism, that tends to reject linguistic novelties of all kinds. But purism is eventually defeated in practically every case. Now, as I said, I regard hyperconformist systems as a good model of the relation between use and meaning. In general, behavior regularities are not norms, nor do they turn into norms. There is no norm to the fact that one ought to have breakfast in the morning, though most people do. But in the case of language, regularities of use, that is linguistic customs, generate norms. There is, for example, an undeniable difference between the breakfast case, a custom that has no normative input, and the case of, say, the Italian word mina, mine. Mina used to be applied to underground cavities where explosives were lodged. Then it came to be applied to the explosives themselves, as it is nowadays. And nowadays, it may not be applied to cavities. Such a use would be utterly unintelligible to speakers of Italian, and it may be applied only to explosives or a certain kind. Feigning to have breakfast may be unusual, but it is not wrong. Calling an underground cavity a mina when speaking Italian is just unacceptable. Now, why, coming to the reasons why language works this way? Why is language almost a hyperconformist system? Why is it that in addition to it being the case that most speakers of English most of the time apply green to objects they take to be of the color of grass in spring, they also may apply green only to objects of that color, and believe as much? Two reasons, two social motivations that could lead speakers of a language to regard regularities of use as carrying normative input, thereby turning them into norms. A first reason has been very often suggested in the literature. They do so for the sake of efficient communication. Bilgrami wrote, I ought to use words as others do if I want to be easily understood. For a speaker who applied green to red apples and blue skies would puzzle interlocutors, and puzzlement is an obstacle to smooth communication. Now, Bilgrami, who is a Davidsonian, therefore a reader of a nice arrangement of epitaphs, hastened to add that speaking as others do may not be a necessary condition of successful communication. However, it makes things much easier. Idiosyncratic uses of words may be creative, but they are often opaque. That is, people don't understand what you are saying. There's another reason, which I take to be no less important than the first. Suppose a speaker does not conform his use of words to the prevailing regularities. For example, out of ignorance, he's, as we say, incompetent, or because of confusion. So she says, I was unconscionable that evening, intending to express the thought that she was unconscious that evening. Now, the hearers may or may not reconstruct what she meant to say. Suppose they do, but suppose they don't. They take the speaker to have meant that she was unconscionable, not unconscious on that evening. They are surely not to blame, because that is what the speaker said. Dames wrote, what the speaker says depends upon the meanings of his words in the common language, even though if she thereby expresses a belief the content of that belief depends on her personal understanding of those words. This is crucial when responsibility is at stake, particularly but not just legal responsibility. A speaker responsible for his assertions as interpreted according to the prevailing regularities of use, i.e., as if he were speaking as others do. In serious business, for example, in a court of law, he could not get away with claiming that, though he did say P, he really meant Q. That is not acceptable. That is not socially and legally acceptable. And there is another side to what is essentially the same phenomenon. It is not just that people tend to take us at our word, that is to assign to our words the meaning in the common language, as Dummett says, call it their standard interpretation. So we better speak in such a way that our words in the standard interpretation reflect the contents we accept to be responsible for. We also must avoid to be held responsible for contents we do not want to be responsible for. Of course, there's no way we can be ensured that we are not going to be misunderstood. That is, that interpretation our words we receive will not be other than the one we meant. But there is a way to guarantee that such divergent interpretations will count as misinterpretations. If the interpretation we want our words to receive is the standard interpretation, any divergent interpretation will count as a misunderstanding of what we said. If I say that it was unconscionable on a certain night, and someone takes me to have implied that I couldn't possibly have witnessed a certain event, for she interprets unconscionable as meaning unconscious, everybody else would agree that her conclusion doesn't follow from what I said. So there's a double motivation for linguistic regularities to be turned into norms. First, if we want communication to be smooth, we ought to speak like others do, that is, complying with the prevailing regularities of use. Secondly, if we want to be assured that we are not going to be held responsible for beliefs, thought, etc., that we do not wish to be held responsible for, typically, though certainly not exclusively because we have no such beliefs or thoughts, we ought to use words in such a way that the interpretation we want them to receive coincides with the standard interpretation, so that standard alternative interpretations will count as misinterpretations. Call this motivation the protection of intended interpretation. In other words, we ought to express the contents we accept to be responsible for in such words, we ought to express the contents we accept to be held responsible for in such words as are normally used to express such contents. Both ways, individual speakers tend to perceive regularities of use as something they would do well to conform to, that is, as amounting to norms. In the paper, I have a section that in which I try to show that in spite of all this, semantic norms are not conditional norms. They remain categorical norms, for the conditionality, so to speak, at a different level. Now, coming finally to the relation between use and meaning. What about statements of meaning? That is, formulations such as profligate. Profligate means completely given up to dissipation and licentiousness. Do they state a fact, as the anti-normativists believe, or do they state a norm, as Wittgenstein, Kripke, and many others believe? My view is that normally they state both a fact and a norm. And in this respect, they resemble Ruth Millikan's pushmi-pullyu representation, i.e. representations that admit of a double reading, both factual and normative. Millikan's example was, "We do not eat peas with our hands," addressed to a child, which is usually understood as recommendation, that is normatively. However, according to Millikan, it also states the fact that normally we do not eat peas with our hands. Similarly, profligate states both that the word is regularly used for dissipate and licentious people and that it ought to be used that way. Notice that according to Millikan, pushmi-pullyu statements are not ambiguous. That is, they do not state sentences that admit of two or more different readings, only one of which is intended in each context, like John went to the bank today. They are supposed to play both roles, descriptive and prescriptive, whenever they are used. Same with statements of meaning like profligate. In the general case, it would be odd to say cat applies to such and such animals, but it may or may not be used to refer to them and only to them. That's odd. If it applies to such animals, why? And it would be equally odd to say cat may apply only to such and such animals, but it is almost never used to refer to them and only to them. Now, in the paper, I have a section that intends to show that the history of dictionaries, the histories of the monolingual dictionary, bears witness to this double nature of statements of meaning. And I also discuss certain controversial cases in which we feel that meaning does not come from regular use, is not grounded in regular use, but is sort of fixed by semantic authorities, people that are in charge of determining what certain expressions mean. For example, there I discussed the case of the word planet, which used to have a certain meaning. Then after a long discussion among astronomers, it was decided that Pluto was no longer a planet, and a new definition of planet was adopted. And it was supposed to be an authoritative adoption. That is, it was supposed to regulate use of the word by the linguistic community as a whole. Now, probably this did not happen, but suppose it does happen, then that would be a case of meaning being fixed not by regularity of use, but by some semantic authority. And there are other cases that are similar to this, and there are several ways of handling such cases. Anyway, in the present context, I take them to be exceptions to the idea that in general meaning comes from regularity of use, is grounded upon regular use. Now, this is not intended as a reduction of meaning to regular use. If meaning is what is described by statements of meaning, such as profligate, then meaning is not just use, as such statements do not just describe some regularity of use. In addition, they state a norm. They say how the expression ought to be used. They are pushmi-pullyu, like rules of politeness, such as the example of peas. It can perhaps be said that meaning involves both a factual regularity and a norm of use without being identical with either. And this is what I meant at the beginning when I said that meaning is not quite use. Thank you. That was it. I can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the talk, Professor Marconi. We have very good timing, over 30 minutes for discussion. So anyone who wants to ask a question, please use the raise your hand button. Preston, you can start.
Yeah, hi. I wanted to ask a question about something you touched on at the end, which I was sort of thinking the whole time. So how do you handle then cases where you have an authority who has a right to declare a new term to mean something, or in the case of the astronomers who decided that planet is going to mean something? You said you mentioned this in the essay, and so I was just curious what that response looks like.
Yeah, of course, the issue only arises when such, let's call them technical or quasi-technical meanings are not generally adopted, because when they are generally adopted by the linguistic community as a whole, then the problem disappears. So we are talking about cases in which astronomers rule that planet ought to be used in a certain way, or if you prefer, means such and such. Planet means such and such. And people simply do not conform. They keep using planet in another way, in the traditional way, let's say. So for them, Pluto is still a planet, and so on and so forth. Or take the word insect. Insect is defined by zoologists in such a way that spiders are not insects. They are arthropods, but they are not insects. But most people, at least in my experience, would say the spiders are insects. They would apply the word insect to a spider. And that's sort of stabilized. That is, regular people have been doing that for a long time. Scientists decided long ago that spiders are not insects, and in spite of that, people kept using insect in an unorthodox way. Now, some people would say that, for example, in the case of planet, there is a common usage and a technical or proper or scientific usage. And they persist together. It's like if you had two words, two homonymous words in the language, planet one and planet two. Planet one is defined as the astronomers say, whereas planet two is defined by general usage. And that's a possible solution. What looks like one word is really two words. Or you may say, well, where is the semantic authority? Where does the semantic authority lie in such cases? Because the difficulty is this, that the scientist suggestions concerning what planet means are not unmotivated. They are not just, like any other speaker. They are authoritative speakers for two reasons. First of all, they are in charge. That is, the whole society charges them with solving that kind of problems. And secondly, that's part of the first reason, they are knowledgeable about planets, about astronomy in general. So they have their own reasons to propose a certain new meaning for the word planet, and they are supposed to be good reasons. So how do you account for that? you may say that in such cases, most speakers are transgressing the semantic norm because that's a case in which the semantic norm is not fixed by general use. It is fixed by semantic authorities. People may or may not go along, but if they refuse to go along, then they systematically misuse the word planet. Yeah, that's about what.
Okay. So I think
there's a little more in the paper, but not much.
Yeah, and I think I see how that would generalize to the case that originally worried me, which was the person who just coins a new term, some Heideggerian philosopher or just whatever, somebody.
Right.
And if I understand you, you're saying there's a kind of second order convention that allows us to ascribe in these limited cases authority. And so I can see how that would still work within the general framework you've set up. So thank you.
Yarda? We can't hear you.
Sorry.
Okay.
I have two questions. First of them concerns the first part of the talk. You said that when I'm mistaken about what a word means and use it wrongly, then it's certainly a mistake, but it's not so clear that it is a semantic mistake. I don't think I understand this. So could you please elaborate on this, why this is not supposed to be a semantic mistake? And well, let me wait with the other question.
Okay. Well, what I said today is more or less this. The let's call it deviant use at issue. The case was of calling a donkey a horse, right? Applying the word horse to an animal that was really a donkey. Now, is that due to incompetence, that is, to lack of knowledge of language? We are supposing that the speaker, is really mistaking that animal for a horse. He sees it as conforming to his notion of horse, which is the correct notion. He's just, say, perceptually wrong, for example. He doesn't see that the animal has very long ears that horses usually don't have, that it is actually smaller than a regular horse. He doesn't see the differences that would make it out as a donkey, not a horse. So in a sense, intuitively, we would say that the guy knows perfectly well what the word horse means, except that he is misapplying the word because, say, of perceptual problems, all sorts of reasons that make it hard for him to identify the animal according to his own correct criteria of identification. That is, we are not in a situation, we are not supposing to be in a situation in which that guy has a wrong notion of horse, and because of that applies the word to a donkey. We are supposing that he's all right, except that he's mistaking the animal for a horse, for a horse in our sense of horse. That is, in that case, we hesitate to say that his error is semantic in nature. We would say, well, he's of course mistaken because that animal is not a horse. But he's not mistaken because he doesn't know what horse means. That's what I had in mind.
Okay. I understand. So semantic means not caused by the speaker's semantic incompetence. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So may I ask one more question, Maciej?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So the other question concerns the conclusion of your talk. So if I understand it properly, there are a lot of customary regularities which are not normative, eating breakfast in the morning and so on. But there are some regularities, especially the linguistic ones, which are turned into norms. So can we say more generally which kinds of regularities have this propensity to be turned into norms? There are linguistic norms for sure, but is there any more general class of regularities which have this tendency? I would assume that it might have to do with the solution of coordination problems, as David Lewis investigated it, or what would you mean?
Well, I didn't go into that at all because I do not have a view on that issue. I said that the only social subsystem that comes close to being a hyperconformist system, though not quite, of course, but comes close, is language. I should have said the only social subsystem that comes to my mind that works that way or appears to work that way is language. There may well be others, actually. You are perfectly right there. That is, one ought to give more thought to that. And it also seems to me that your suggestion is promising, namely that the issue may be the coordination problem. That is, whenever we are dealing not with individual patterns of behavior, widespread but individual forms of behavior, but with, in a sense, collective patterns of behavior, that is, they require coordination, then we may have something like for example, imagine children that start playing a certain game sort of spontaneously. That is, they are not making reference to any rules for the game. They make them, as Wittgenstein said, they make them up as they go along. At some point, they have to fix the rules. Otherwise, confusion ensues. And so, they just turn their pattern of behavior into a rule in the sense of a norm, something they all ought to abide by. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I will use my authority. Okay, Antonio, go ahead. I will ask later.
Okay, I have a bunch of questions. I'll just ask two. One is very, very naive, and it's about metaphorical uses of words and how do they look like in the hyperconformist framework that you outlined. And the second is, if you could just expand on why you think semantic normativity is not the semantic norms are not conditional norms, but stay categorical norms.
Now, in the case of metaphors, I believe one ought to make a distinction between established metaphorical uses of words that we more or less all of us understand without any difficulty, and new metaphors that are created at some point by someone. In the first case, it seems to me that metaphorical uses are just separate uses of a certain sound or script. Like, you know, there are words that have many different senses that are recorded in dictionaries and so on and so forth. Even, you know, relatively slight differences are recorded by dictionaries, but they are treated as maybe related senses, but independent senses of the words. Now, each of them counts as one meaning in the sense I have been talking about meaning and its relation to use and so on and so forth. Now, the introduction of a new metaphorical use, of course, is a different issue, and it seems to me that it goes along on the model of the introduction, on the general model of introducing a new sense of an old word. When you introduce a new sense of an old word, you are operating some sort of transgression, because that doesn't exist in the language. But the transgression may stick because it is imitated by many people. When we started calling this object a mouse, that was a transgression in a way. Mice are animals, they are not objects one uses with computers and so forth. But that innovation, that novelty stuck. And that became an entirely legitimate use of that sound, mouse. There is innovation in language. In every innovation is initially a transgression. It's a proposal for novelty. After a while, if the transgression is accepted and generalizes, then a new meaning is born, so to speak, because there is regular use of a certain expression to designate certain objects and so on and so forth. Now, concerning conditionalization, one could raise the following objection. When you say, to me, when you say that there are reasons for turning regularities into norms, aren't you saying something like, if you want to get such and such a result, for example, getting easily along with other speakers, being easily understood, if you want that, then you ought to speak like everybody does. That would make that into a conditional norm, if you want to be easily understood. You may have no desire for being easily understood. You might be like Mrs. Malaprop or people like that. It's conceivable anyway. So the reason why you may want to speak like everybody else is that you want to be easily understood, or you want to make it such that deviant interpretations of what you said will count as misinterpretations, misunderstandings. That is, you want to preserve intended interpretation. If you want to preserve intended interpretation, then you ought to speak according to the rule. You want to follow the semantic norm. If you don't care about preserving intended interpretation, then you speak whatever you like. Now, this is not the right way, in my opinion, is not the right way to look at the phenomena I have been trying to describe. That is, these phenomena do not concern each individual word in the language. They concern the functioning of the linguistic machinery as a whole. That is, language is such an activity as it is, so to speak, motivated by interest, social interest of the kind I pointed out, that is smoothen our communication, preserving the intended interpretation, and so on. These are conditions for language to do its job. They are not conditions for using word man in a certain way. Of course, these general conditions for the working of language as a whole reflect upon use of each individual words, but you do not have one of these conditions for each word, so to speak. So they are not part of the meaning of each individual word. They are rather they should rather be regarded as conditions on the functioning of the linguistic machinery as such. That's how I see it, but I want to think more of that. I wouldn't be scandalized if the normativity of language turned out to be conditional upon such social motivations. But it seems to me that that would be a misunderstanding. My intuition right now is that that's wrong.
No, thank you. That's great. That answers all my questions. I have many follow-ups, but I'd like Mate to ask his questions.
Thanks, Antonio. So I will ask, I have also many questions, but I will ask one. I like your idea of understanding language as some kind of hyperconformist system. And even I think that this idea might be supported by research in developmental psychology, where children show very strong propensity to follow customs as they would be norms. So when they see that something is done regularly in their environment, then they protest when they see that someone does something else or in some way breach what they see as a custom. There is though one thing that I think kind of prohibits or make it more problematic to see this research in developmental psychology as being connected to your view, and that is, according to me, that you see the motivation for seeing language as a hyperconformist system in rational decisions of particular speakers. So if I want to avoid being misunderstood, then I should do something. And it seems like children do this spontaneously. They do not think about the consequences of their actions. They just do this spontaneously. So I do not think that that this tension is very serious, but it's something, I don't know, to think about. And I would like to hear what you think about it.
Yeah. Well, I said at the very beginning of the presentation of this idea of hyperconformist system that there is a nice amount of conformism in society in general, right? We are conformist animals. The conformism that is at stake in the case of language is very strong with respect to other forms of conformism. So, for example, children are very conformist. You are right. Children tend to be extremely conformist, even where adults, grown-ups, perhaps wouldn't be as conformist as they are. They are irritated and maybe sometimes even scared by deformity, but not by non-conformity. They tend to see something dangerous there. I granted that. I mean, I granted all that. It still seems to me that the case of language is peculiar with respect to widespread conformism that we find everywhere. I mean, whenever someone tells you, are you watching a VHS? Are you crazy? That's conformism. I mean, there's nothing, I would reply, what's wrong with watching a VHS rather than a DVD or going to Netflix or whatever? And that would be an acceptable answer. Whereas if you say, look, you shouldn't call that object a casserole because it's a book, I cannot say, well, so what? What's wrong with calling it a casserole? I just like the sound of the word. I always did. So I call it a casserole. I mean, there's nothing terrible about such behavior. It's just a bit crazy, let's say. It's a way of opting out of language. Right? We cannot opt out of language as it is. And for example, poets do it all the time, right? And that's part of their business in a sense. But regular speakers usually don't, because it's sort of inconvenient, strongly inconvenient, for the reasons I tried to explain.
Okay, thanks. I agree definitely that language is in some respects different than Netflix example you used. Maybe I would like to emphasize that there might be more areas in our social life that are special in this respect. But otherwise, yeah, I agree with your response that language is special.
Good.
We are running out of time, so if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you for the talk and for your contribution to the issue.
I thank you for the very interesting discussion. Thanks. Thank you.
And I would like to thank everyone who attended these lectures. This is the last talk of the series, and the issue that accompanies the series is about to be published in Philosophical Topics. So if anyone wants to read the final version of Professor Marconi's paper, then it should be out in a month or so. Follow our website or the website of Philosophical Topics. Once again, thank you all for attending, and see you at some other occasion.
Thank you.